So they have that point of view because they've read certain things, they've studied with certain people,
absolutely.
They've gotten feedback now from a community of people that they agree with. And so when a reviewer comes in and he says this and this and this about this, in a way, it's not just him speaking, it's his community. The alternative is when you just give a dry presentation, you're sitting in one of your communities, right? You're doing only what that community is. You haven't found yourself. You're just repeating a kind of community norms and this. And you see a lot of students doing this and even a lot of senior scientists doing this. They stay within those norms. But to even just come up there and let yourself be seen as a person, even if you don't talk anything about yourself, just in the way that you express yourself, you let yourself be seen. That's this other thing. That's that finding yourself and finding yourself in the communities. And in education, our task is to find ourselves into all these communities, and then to transform the communities because we have something to say out of ourselves. Still, what I'm saying is there was still that, as misguided as it was still that thing trying to push through saying, you want to grow, you want to continue to grow. And that's been a catchword for me. I'm still growing, still learning, not intellectually sometimes, really just completely unintellectually. But learning still.
Okay, great. So today on my podcast, I have Professor Bruce Kirchoff. And hi, Bruce. I will introduce him shortly, and so that everyone can get an idea what we are going to talk about and the background and expertise of Professor Bruce Kirchoff. And then we will talk loosely about, I think, almost everything. So Professor Bruce Kirchoff is an American botanist and educator. He is Professor Emeritus of Biology at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where he served from 1986 to 2022. Kirchoff was born in 1952 in Detroit, Michigan. He earned a Bachelor of General Studies with distinction from the University of Michigan in 1975, followed by a Master of Science in Biology in 1977 from the same institution. He completed his PhD in botany at Duke University in 1981. Kirchoff's research focused on plant evolution from structural and developmental perspectives. He has also studied methods to improve the use of morphological characters in evolutionary analysis and has developed visual learning software for organism identification. He continues to make contributions through his work with scientific communication and teaching improvisational theater to cancer survivors. This is also a very interesting topic. I guess if this comes up, we can also talk about that. So welcome, Bruce, on board.
Hi, nice to be here.
Yeah, by the way, I see you have a wonderful background from Croatia, as you told me. I think it's very inviting in case someone had the same question that I had, because I said, where is this? The first thing that came to my mind. Yeah, I think, as I understand it, we will talk mainly and focus our conversation of the states of consciousness and consciousness in general, and eventually also digress wherever the conversation leads us. So, Bruce, if you would like to introduce yourself eventually with further information, just this dry introduction is maybe not very, doesn't reflect your real personality. And also introduce yourself, and let's see what you have to tell us also about the topic of consciousness.
Well, anyway, been interested in consciousness for a very long time. I'm also a very long-term student of Rudolf Steiner and his work with theosophy and then anthroposophy. I had a very somewhat difficult relationship with the formal organization of Rudolf Steiner's work as it existed in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and eventually left the society. I was a member of his Anthroposophical Society, and I don't remember exactly when I left, but it was around 2005, 2003, in that area someplace, and have not rejoined, but have continued being influenced by his thought. So that's a very important trend in the way that I think about and look at the world, was my understanding of the thought and experiences even more than thought of Rudolf Steiner. So I suppose that is one reason that I got interested in consciousness. I think the other reasons were, my background in Steiner. So I encountered Steiner when I was 19 through education, through Waldorf education. I just went to a lecture on Waldorf education because I had thought when I was young that I didn't like my education very much, especially in the United States. So I had a funny trajectory. So I went through American education system up through the junior year, finished the junior year in high school. And then my parents moved to Germany for my father's work. And there was no school that I could go to near where they lived, which was up in the Bonn, Bad Godesberg, Cologne area. And so the company, the Ford Motor Company, paid for me to go to a private school. And the one that I chose was in Switzerland. In the time that I was there, the school that I went to was in a really tiny little town called Vezia, which was just north of Lugano. It was the American school in Switzerland, and their main campus is someplace else. It's in another Montenegro. It's in another city across the lake, around the lake, let's say, which I very rarely visited that campus. But if you were to look up at American School of Switzerland, you would see buildings and things that I had no connection with at all, because it only existed in this one little villa for a couple of years and I was there for one of them. So I had these two very different educational experiences. In my high school in the United States, I used to sit in the back of the math class with my friends and play games and not really pay much attention and understand all the material. They were a little faster than I was. I did pay attention some. They often just sat there and played chess. But we always felt that we weren't really learning what we wanted to learn. We could get the level of the material that they were teaching us was pretty easy. So we talked to them, let's try to do calculus, and we were pretty much told we were not smart enough to do calculus. They weren't going to offer it, which was now, as an adult, you can see this was a real reflection of this guy, the chair of the math department, what he thought. And what he thought about himself and about his ability to teach calculus wasn't really about us at all. Because I went to Switzerland and I took calculus. Guess that. And I got AP credit for that and could skip a semester of calculus at college because I had it in high school. So I had those two experiences. And so I was reading in the alternative education literature at that time. So at that time, when I said, or maybe for 20 years after that, when I said, oh yeah, I read Summerhill before, while I was in high school, that really meant something to people. People don't know Summerhill anymore. Yeah. So yeah, you do. Okay.
Yeah, it's really pity. Yeah, I will.
Yeah, so
it's say about that.
It's a book on perhaps the first free school. I think it was in the UK.
And it's in 1911, I think it was first.
So it's been a long time.
It's more than a century, and still we are here and talking about these things. Yeah.
So I had read that, and I read some other things, but that was the main book. And so when there was a lecture on Waldorf education, at the end of my freshman year, I was living in the dorm. I saw a poster in the dorm saying there's this lecture. I went to it, and it was all right. I didn't have a particularly one way or another feeling about it that I recall. But standing at the back of the room, there were these two people. Okay, now, so my self-image has always been something like you show you here. Of course, I was younger then and more handsome and more hair. But at that time, my hair was very long. I had a beard that was very big, pretty big. And I thought that the only way to grow a beard was not to take care of it. You shouldn't cut it. It should just be natural. And so I looked very much like a 1970s hippie. And so there are these people at the back of the room, and they are very welcoming. I want to say their names because I owe them a lot, and I was finally able to tell them. So that was Peter and Mary Smith. And Peter Smith was a professor in the chemistry department at the University of Michigan. They were so welcoming, and they said, "Oh, you want to borrow a book? Come over to our house. We have lots of books. We'd love to talk to you." I just felt me so welcome. And because of that, I went to the library and got a book on Waldorf education and read it and slowly got involved after that. But it was really, I really like that story because it really says something about, it should say something to people who are interested in Steiner about, how you attract people to it. It's not about the intellect. It's not about intellectual knowledge, which so many people who follow Steiner think it's about understanding something. And here I got involved because of a human connection like that. So, yeah. So I think that got me involved in it. I remember one of my first questions as I started to be a graduate student. And I was influenced by Steiner now for about a year or 2 years at this point, maybe 3. And so I wanted to know why people sleep. And I know you've talked about this to other people. And so I went to the medical library at the University of Michigan.
Just made a podcast. The last podcast I made was precisely about this topic. So you may.
And I heard that. And so that's why I'm following up. So I went to the University of Michigan library, and you had to look things up then. You had to use these paper indices and all this stuff. It's not very different way of finding articles then. But I could go to the shelves. I could pull down the article. I could look at the articles about sleep. And basically, I found out that they don't know anything about sleep. And, there were you could do some measurements on it, but that was about it.
And this didn't change until nowadays, in my opinion, but okay.
Yeah, I got that from your last podcast. There wasn't big advances in understanding why we sleep. And Steiner he didn't really exactly have an explanation for it, but there was a lot more that Steiner said about sleep that was more interesting to me. And so, but I always thought that was interesting when I talked to sleep researchers and things that say, that was my first scientific question. Why do we sleep? And if there had been more about it, if there'd been more substantial work about it, it's one of those questions you say, well, look, I had this question. Why didn't I go into that area? And I didn't go into that area or pursue it in any way because it seemed like there was nothing there. And I just couldn't, I didn't have as a young person, you don't have a handle on how to attack really difficult, intractable questions that no one needs to do. You need to have a mentor that helps you into those areas, and there wasn't one. So, well, anyway, so that's some background for me and a little bit about how I got involved in consciousness, and then was a long road from that.
Yeah. It's very interesting because there are a lot of similarities between your path in your life and your experiences with mine. There are a lot of parallels because, in fact, I was for 3 years a teacher in a Waldorf school, and I also had a contact with Rudolf Steiner, and which was for me a sort of double-edged sword, in a sense that there are a lot of similarities and a lot of things that resonated with me. But then when I went to this school, I must say I was a bit disappointed. because the schools were not really that kind of alternative education that I was looking for. And I'm wondering if how far they nowadays reflect Rudolf Steiner's ideas or not. But in any case, yeah, I had a similar experience, and I began very passionately about the education, the subject of education, because I suffered a lot also as a young child from childhood, and even through not only school but also college. That I never, what you said, I never could really learn what I was interested in. Yeah? And that was really lacking for me. And I then tried to look for these alternative school system, alternative educational paradigms. And yeah, I thought that the Waldorf system would be this real alternative, that then and nowadays I unfortunately have to change my mind. Whereas you mention Summerhill and these so-called democratic schools, yeah, I've never been there. So I can't say anything from my personal experience. But they, at least from what I read, at a more theoretical level, let's put it in this way, they reflect and represent much more what I really perceive is necessary today as an educational paradigm, or at least perhaps not for everyone, but at least for a part of the young generation who is really, they have questions and they look for answers and want to learn from this inquiry. Yeah? And very often we are not allowed to do that, and still. And we are in 2025 and still coming up with these issues, which are not new at all. They have been, as you said, in this Summerhill School, I think it was in 1911, before the First World War. It was introduced in Great Britain. Huh? And it still struggles, this idea, to get through our society. Yeah, so in this sense, I resonate very much with your curriculum, in a sense. Yeah, great. So now I saw, just browsing through the internet, I saw several talks of you about the issue, no, not the issue, about the topic of the states of consciousness. How can you summarize, perhaps, because you have a particular message which also resonates very much with my view, even though you have taken a very different perspective, which is not, I don't think it's contrary, it's quite the opposite. It complements very well the idea that I had exposed just also recently in a Substack post about multiperspectivity. And what can you tell us about this? Where you talk about the states of consciousness, why is it important in our society? Why is it this kind of topic that interests you so much?
Well, I think there's two parts of that question before I even talk about consciousness, and that is, why is it important in our society and why is it important to me? And I don't know if it's important in society. It's important to me. And because it's important to me, it has an influence on the people that I know, which has an influence on society. And that's kind of the way I look at things. I don't, I'm practicing more and more speaking in the first person. And in fact, I was going to say, we should try this today. We should just try to do everything in the first person and see how that changes the conversation, if it changes it at all. So in speaking in the first person, it's very hard to say, oh, the world is this way. I know the absolute truth of the world. I mean, you can say that, but it sounds pretty stilted there. Instead of our normal language, the way of talking, we have that in our language already, that, there are some steps. These steps exist in Croatia, and that's an objective fact according to that way of speaking. Whereas I can say, I've walked up these steps in Croatia and down to this little area next to the river where I took, well, not to the river, to the Aegean, where I turned around and took the picture. It's kind of a different way of looking, I find anyway. Notice that I didn't make that objective there, that I find it's a different way of looking at those steps and at any kind of experience. So so consciousness has been important to me because, gosh, for a lot of reasons. I guess one reason I got that kind of led over into consciousness was that it's very related to what we were just saying about education, except that now I'm a PhD scientist out doing postdoc work. I had 5 years of postdocs. And actually part of that was spent in Jerusalem, which is a whole different story. So I did a postdoc in Jerusalem, which was great. And I'm wondering why it's so difficult to bring alternative ideas into science. Why can't I do things differently? Why can't I talk about experiences like I talk about this experience of the stairs? Why can't I talk about plants in that way? And I can't. I mean, it's really clear. But why can't I? Well, those kind of questions eventually led to me to explore ideas of social constructionism. Mm-hmm. And I approached that then through looking at people who were criticizing science. And at that time that I was working on this, which would have been very late 1980s, early-ish 1990s, I was kind of working on this on my own outside. So I had my regular career, and then this kind of thing was going on as on the side as much as I could. So much of science, of interesting science, actually gets done on the side of something that you were supposed to be doing. Mm. And at that time, the people who were really criticizing science that I could find were in two camps. One were the feminist critiques of science. And the feminists were critiquing science and the methods of science because there was this idea still prevalent in the 1990s that women could not do science. They were genetically or biologically incapable of doing science. And of course, you have intelligent women out there saying, wait a minute, that doesn't seem quite right to me. There's something going on here that doesn't have to do with the way that I experience myself. Yeah. And what I think I've done. And so they started looking at that. What's going on there? What's going on with that? And so they were approaching the idea that what we say about science is socially constructed. They didn't exactly say that, but it started, my recollection is it got close, but they were certainly deconstructing it. They were trying to tear apart these ideas that women couldn't do science, and that there was something objective and true about the science that was found by men. When men said something, it was true. And when women said something, even though it was scientific, it had this area of subjectivity to it. Yeah. Which all that stuff is, of course, crazy. And that they were the first ones that I knew of to really deconstruct it. So Evelyn Fox Keller, especially, Helen Logino, I think, also was a scientist. What was her field? It wasn't molecular biology, because that didn't quite exist then, but it was in that direction. And she ended up dropping out of her science career and wrote a book on in these same areas that I'm talking about now. And I can't remember the title of her book. Maybe it'll come back to me. So that was one area, feminist critiques of science. And the other one was there was philosophical currents, European philosophical currents, because Americans tended not to think these way, especially Bruno Latour from France, who talked about the social construction of science, basically, the social construction of knowledge, sociology of knowledge. So those things really influenced me. And eventually I started working those ideas out in a series of 3 papers that were published in kind of weird places, because that's who would publish them. I got a little bit of money from the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which still exists in California. Yeah. I had a friend who had a real good connections there, and he was able to get me a small grant from them, and I used that to write what they called a research report for them. So that was one of the papers published there. So obviously no real peer review of that. I did publish later on, I published a paper, I tried to publish in Journal of Consciousness Studies, which was a relatively new journal at that time, and it was rejected. And they sent it to the wrong, and it's the same thing that you've talked about in your blog post you just said about multiperspectivity. They sent it to the wrong people. I mean, they sent it to people who criticize it from their point of view.
Yeah.
They couldn't see multiple points of view there. And I pointed that out to the editor, and he said, yeah, we have that problem a lot. We send it to the wrong reviewers and they don't understand it and things, but he wouldn't send it out. He wouldn't send it out again to another reviewer, which, really was the right thing to do when you say these reviewers were really completely wrong about their interpretation of the paper, which I think he admitted. Still wouldn't send it out. So that ended up being published in a book. It wasn't something like Considering Consciousness Across the Disciplines or like that. And of course, because it's in a book, I think basically no one read it ever. I put it up on the internet now through my university. We got permission to do that, but that's scientific publishing of when you're trying to say something that is not.
Yeah. I know this all too well because I also just published in the last years. I published some papers also on the Journal of Consciousness Studies, and there I have the same problem. They sent it to two reviewers. One reviewer was okay, said it's okay, it can be published. The other reviewer said it's nonsense. I answered, his review is nonsense. And at the end, the editor agreed. And so agreed with me, fortunately. So I was able to get it through nevertheless. But it's what you say, in fact, summarizes the problem that we have nowadays with the peer review system, that people are unwilling to take these different perspectives, see how we see the world is our way of seeing the world, and we are unwilling to accept another point of view of the same subject, of the same topic. Yeah? For example, I make very often the example in quantum physics. There's this weird idea of the many worlds interpretation, and that they have this idea that every time that someone makes a measurement, or the whole universe splits into multiple worlds. And so personally, I find this absolute nonsense, but but we must be also honest on this. Nothing in our present science forbids us to take this perspective. If you like it, okay, I say. So as a reviewer, I would look at the content. I would look on the logical coherence of the paper and of the content of the paper. But I would not reject someone who favors this many world interpretation only because it's not my point of view. And unfortunately, in the peer review process, in the modern scientific publishing, we have really this problem that the review system, by the way, is in crisis also because of this problem. When we talk about consciousness, and also educational paradigms, inevitably, there are subjective perceptions. Everyone has one's own bias, and everyone has one's own philosophical preference. And we are not willing to give up to allow other philosophical preferences and want to impose our philosophical preference. And that's in fact a problem. And I had this also with the mind-brain identity theory. I published a paper on the mind-brain identity theory, and which is essentially makes a sort of evaluation between a dualist and a physicalist point of view of consciousness. And so it goes into the subject of the hard problem of consciousness, of neurology, and also to some degree also biology. And it was so much that the tension, between the reviewers was so strong that I think I'm only one of the few who published a paper with 6 peer reviewers. 6 had to go, because one accepted, the other rejected, one accepted, the other rejected, one accepted, and the other. So, and the editors didn't know what to do. And the problem was not the content, but the philosophical perspective and the ideological background that everyone has. And we all have our ideological background, if we like it or not, but we must be aware of it. And that's what is missing.
So we are talking about the social constructionism of science now.
Yeah.
And I wanted to make that link because it might seem like we're just talking about peer reviews or kind of obscure issues that wouldn't be interesting to anyone except who's writing papers. But I think there are very important things here that are much more general.
It is a reflection of the social construct of science,
yes.
This issue, yeah?
Yes, and I want to move us toward the social constructionism because it's something that I think people don't pay attention to when we have these kinds of discussions. And but this discussion that we're having is exactly the way how I got into it. Right. So this was my entree into these questions. What's going on here? Why is it so difficult to do these things? So now let's take one of those reviewers of one of your papers or my papers and look at them a little more detail. Yeah. So that reviewer, we would say traditionally just has a certain kind of philosophical or an approach that they're taking, but that misses something, and it misses the community that they're embedded in. So they have that point of view because they've read certain things, they've studied with certain people.
Absolutely.
They've gotten feedback now from a community of people that they agree with. And so when a reviewer comes in and he says this and this and this about this, in a way, it's not just him speaking, it's his community. There may be individual things that he would say different than a next person is, but still there's a relatively wide but still confined group of opinions that work around that community. Now, those communities can also be nested. So you can have, a philosophical community that says only analytical philosophy, where you can clearly lay out your arguments and you can show, so that you can show the arguments clearly. That's the only type of philosophical argument that should ever be accepted, especially so if that means that, as I had one of my colleagues who my whole university is analytical philosophy, and I was walking out of the library one day carrying a book by a phenomenologist, and he looked down at the title of the book I was carrying and he tapped it and said, "That's all bullshit." Yeah. So they can have, that's a certain kind of approach philosophy, but that can be embedded in other kinds of worldviews. It could be embedded in a worldview that is physicalist, that will only accept physical kind of explanations, which is not necessarily the only way you could look at analytical philosophy. So I'm trying to say that, these communities are not like, they're not like little ball bearings that are out there. They're permeable to each other. They're nested in each other. Yeah. They influence each other. And if you were to look at a person, then you might say, well, here's Bruce, and okay, here's Bruce where I'm standing, but here's one community, he involves it here. Here's another community here. Here's another community here. Here's another community here. And someplace in that, all of those intersections of those things, we find the person who I call myself, who I call Bruce. So Bruce is, in that sense, socially constructed. I mean, I said one of my communities is the community around Rudolf Steiner. And I've had immense problems with them. I mean, really immense problems with them. And, but that doesn't mean that they didn't influence me and that there isn't, I don't have to be a dyed in the wool, a anthroposophist. I don't have to be an anthroposophist who only quotes Steiner, and there are a lot of those, or thinks that's the only reasonable thing to do because Steiner had the whole truth, could never make a mistake, and so what we just do is we learn his intellectual things. And no, I'm not that kind of anthroposophist, but there are, and so that community can be permeable, right? And so those people over here, let's say they're over here who have this idea about quoting Steiner, well, they're influenced by other communities, right? That influence. Maybe they grew up in a very religious household that was very fundamentalist, and they're still carrying some of those kinds of things that they bring in anthroposophy. So they're still a member of this anthroposophic Steiner community, but they've got these other influences there that are bringing in. So this little picture of Bruce in the center of all his communities works for them too. And we just have these little bits of overlaps. So yeah, okay, I'm going to be quiet for a minute and let you react, and then we'll see where we go.
No, I totally agree. It's not at all. I was a bit focused because, it was also a bit a sort of excruciating experience for me because it took months and months to go through all these processes. But you're absolutely right. This is a consequence of our social constructs, not only in science, but in everything, as you say, also in religion. And it's all intertwined. We are the children of our time, and probably also of times that are past and gone, but we still carry a certain baggage. Our worldview is not our own real worldview. It is something that we reflect from others without being aware of it. And that's a real problem, because I think it's unavoidable to have some sort of worldview, some sort of opinion, some sort of perspective, and so on. But when you say physicalist, and also the anti-physicalist, we can say the same thing for the spiritualist. But since we are more in the academic environment, usually, at least in my domain, physics and so on, physicalism prevails. But why? Because we have been raised with this kind of worldview, which is a reductionist worldview, which does not mean that it is wrong, but it's just one perspective. And when you study for your whole life, only matter in a reductionist way, and then you are confronted with something that is not really so easily to reduce to particles that follow the laws of differential equations, and you can see it. I can see it also in very famous physicists, also some Nobel laureates and Nobel Prize winners, that when they are confronted with some more philosophical issues, philosophical questions, they are utterly unable to go beyond their own worldview that they have been grown up with. And which, again, we all have been grown up with a particular bias, but you must be aware that this is your bias. So I totally agree with you about that.
Because so now let's look at those communities. We've got these communities that I belong to, and somehow I am finding myself in the midst of all of these communities. But each of those communities has a certain, let's say, a feel to it. So if I'm so I've just started to go to a church, and I really cannot believe I'm saying this, because I didn't go to a church for 50 years. But my daughter got us involved in a church, and we walked into the church and we just felt completely welcomed. I've never had that experience in a church before. And so it feels like something to be in that church. It feels like something to be over here in a group of scientists. It feels, so when I was in Croatia, working with this so-called young investigators network, none of them were young. These were the best molecular biologists in Europe and Asia. I was really not completely prepared. I tried to get prepared. I tried very hard, but I didn't really understand what level they were at. I mean, there was a guy in my class who flew in from Japan He stayed one night. He went to my class. He flew back to Japan because he was going to another workshop. And everyone was kind of at that incredible level with big labs, big research projects and things. Okay, that felt something really different than being with normal scientists. It was very stimulating and exciting, and something that at my little university, which has its own strengths, it's a very diverse student body. We make a big difference in students' lives because it really enhances social mobility at my university. This was a different group, completely different group than that. These were the elite of the elite. It's called Young Investigator Network because they try to get them young, and then they're in there for their life, and they give them lots of money, and they give them lots of resources. So there's a kind of, I'm saying a feeling, Steiner would say there's a beingness to it. When you have a strong experience of this, it feels like it's being in the presence of a very strong-willed person, except maybe that person has now left the room. So they were just there and they took up all the atmosphere in the room and you could really feel their presence, and now they left. And it feels, being in some of these groups where there's a strong sense of difference from what you've experienced before, it has that kind of feeling to it. So these groups, these social groups, are really can be very, very strong, which is why it's so hard to have conversations across the different groups, I find, and why we have such a hard time doing it. So it's for me, it's also kind of a spiritual thing. There are these, we'd say, not just these social groups out there, but there are these spiritual groups, even if they have nothing to do, and they would abhor the word spiritual, a belief in the soul, physical reality of the world. That's all there is to it, is a very strong presence there that people who are there have a very hard time to get out of it. Now, one thing that's really interesting about those people, now let me be one of those people. Here I am, physicalist, only believe that the physical is there, but I've got these other communities. Maybe there's a religious community I belong to. And I've seen some of my colleagues where a colleague of mine passed away unexpectedly. I don't remember, it wasn't a heart attack, but it was something severe like that. And we went to the service for him. So a lot of the faculty went. And I watched faculty members who I thought had no possible interest in religion get up and take communion. I said, whoa, yeah. There is something else going on here that I didn't know about these people. And so even though they've been this community that kind of holds them into that physicalist place, they've got these other communities that are there. And we shouldn't forget that, because otherwise we start saying, oh, well, you're just this, you're just this. Yeah. And it's oftentimes we don't really know what they are. So what I think, that's our task is, and maybe this is when bringing it back to what we both have our experiences in evolution. I think in education, our task is to find ourselves into all these communities, and then to transform the communities because we have something to say out of ourselves. Now, it may be that, there are people who feel that earlier in their lives than others and are just pushing against what they're learning and things because they want to find themselves. They're like, oh yeah, I'm 18 and I don't know where I am. I don't know what I'm doing on things. And I really want to. Some people are like that and they despair, and other people might be like that and they say, oh yeah, this is not satisfying me. I want more than this. So it's been, and probably very strong influence from Steiner in this, so that would be pretty early when I was 19, start getting this idea that personal growth is so important.
Yeah.
I mean, I told you I read the first book on Waldorf education, but now, so this is not a pleasant story about myself. It's telling a story about myself that is about personal growth. So the second book that I took was Knowledge of the Higher Worlds and Its Attainment. And I picked it up in the spring after I saw that lecture. I bought that book And I took it home and said, oh, I'm going to do these exercises at home. And I'm going to come back in the fall and everyone will know how great I am because I've accomplished everything that Steiner talks about in this book. And I got back to Germany in the summer. I did some work in the summer. I worked in Germany a little bit and I traveled a little bit and I read one page of the book. So it kind of had to come home to me there that there was maybe a little more work to do. It took many years to get, farther in that book and actually do some of the
can
things
be cryptic.
Steiner was talking about. But still, what I'm saying is there was still that, as misguided as it was still that thing trying to push through, saying, you want to grow, you want to continue to grow. And that's been a catchword for me. I'm still growing, still learning, not intellectually sometimes, really just completely unintellectually. But learning still.
It is.
I'm 73 now.
Yeah, yeah. It's first and foremost an inner growth that is not related to something intellectual. It's not about more information and more things to know and more books to read. It's not about bookish knowledge. It is, I would call it still a knowledge, a sort of, but also of inner maturity on how to look upon the world. And that gives you also a perspective and a kind of knowledge. Here I may make my metaphysical digression and my personal theory. It's not my theory, but it's my personal belief that we are souls, and these souls in the evolutionary process learn, but not learn in the sense of the intellect. There is a psychic, a psychological growth in whatever we do in our life. And the real problem that we have today is that, and I think that we see this especially in young people who would like break through the barriers that are imposed by this social construct and by the society and by the institutions, by the way, also, and which reflect also these social constructs. Very often I see, and I can't help, I can't do nothing against it, but I see these young souls that are imprisoned, are caged into societal construction, institution, and struggle to go beyond, but they can't because there's an external pressure. It's not only just institutional, it's also the family, it's the religion, it's our belief system, and parents or not sometimes. And if we keep it on the academic level, I would also say that there are these groups, and I feel well in more or less every group. And that's where I at least try to be multiperspectival, because I can see quite well, even if I don't agree very often with the physicalist, they have also very good points. I'm at home with the spiritualist. In a sense, I'm also at home with the New Age tralala. Even if these are also the expression of a certain naivety, of still undeveloped desire to bring things together. So this New Age movement, this was some time ago, we called that New Age. Now we call them spiritualist, whatever. But it is an attempt to bring things together. Sometimes, however, it's a bit a mess, in my personal opinion, at least. But I feel at home with them too. I feel at home, for example, also with Richard Dawkins, that you know certainly very well, who is a modern symbol of the materialist, physicalist. I can see his points. It's interesting. And the real difficulty is to see how these groups that you describe, there's not someone who's the guy who's on the right side and the others are the wrong. they are all a bit a mixture of truth and falsehood, I think, every group. Yeah. And the great challenge that we have today is to be able to see the truth and the falsehood in every one of these groups. Yeah.
Well,
So,
of
yeah.
course, many of the groups would say, if they're very strong groups, would say, I have the truth. I mean, I think
Yeah.
River Dawkins thinks he's got the truth, and
Yeah.
he's not going to listen. I mean, there's tremendous
Yeah.
amount of evidence that he doesn't have the whole truth. If you would
Yeah.
look at it, I mean, evidence from near-death
Thanks.
experiences, evidence from children who remember past lives, evidence from adults who remember past lives. I mean, there's something else going on in the world, and he finds the things in those that are the least well supported.
Yeah.
And he says, well, this thing is not well supported. Therefore, I can throw out the whole area and not use it and keep it myself. So there can be areas, things like this, communities like this, and I've used him as an example of that community, but there's certainly quite a few other people in that community, and they would say they have the truth and things. And that's one of the reasons I like first person perspectives, is because it's very difficult to do that. And so, I would, if I was saying what you just said a minute ago, I would say that I find in all of these different communities what is meaningful for me, and I take that as part of my personal growth so that I can grow into more fully who I am, and through growing more fully in my end, will be able to influence or act in the world in different kinds of ways because I'm more of myself. And so for me, looking at communities that I don't agree with sometimes, you have to make decisions about, am I going to read another Richard Dawkins book? How many of those do I need to read and things to say, or how many New Age seances, they don't call them seances anymore, channelings, how many of those do I need to go to? And I have a pretty strong sense of when I'm done with something like that. I say, yeah, okay, that's interesting, but it's not for me. Yeah. And then I go out there and I look at communities. So we have this a lot in the United States now. So especially in my state, if you are a grade school teacher, you have to post online the title of every book in your classroom. Mm-hmm. And so that people can look at it and make sure that you're not abusing the kids or teaching them critical race theory or something like that. Critical race theory is a big bugaboo in certain communities now in the United States. So that community knows what the community that's forcing those things, they know what's right. They absolutely know what's right. And they can't listen to anything else. And not only do they know what's right, they are going to force it on you. They're going to say, you have to think that my view is right, that my community is the strongest one. And so, trying to use a first person perspective can break that down a little bit, because they have to say it's not right for me. And already when they say it's not right for me, they start to question a little bit, could this be right for someone else? Yeah. Exactly. I'm not sure it's a magic bullet, but I think first person perspectives have a lot to offer.
What do you mean exactly by first person perspective? I have my own understanding of that, but I would just check whether we mean the same thing by that. What do you mean by?
Well, I mean at the simplest level, I just mean making statements about what I experience or I have read or I have learned, instead of making objective experiences and I tried to give an example at the beginning, an objectivist approach. There is a stairway along the seaside in Croatia, just outside the city of Split, and here's a picture of it. Or I have walked down a stairway next to the Aegean Sea near in Croatia, and I turned around and I took a picture of it, which now you can see here. So knowledge is it's all through me. It's everything it is. So there are Native American languages that, as I understand. Now, I'm not a Native American. I don't have that heritage. I don't mean to speak for them, but I'm going to do what I learned from studying a little bit Navajo and Hopi ways of
Yeah.
speaking. And that is, I would say, I have read that the Navajo and Hopi language use phrases like I've just used now, so that when I want to say something that I have learned in Hopi or Navajo, I would always say, I have read, or I have heard it said, or maybe,
Yeah.
I have heard from Marco that his opinion is, right? So it all becomes transformed then through the human eye, the human experience, which brings us back to finding yourself in all these different communities, right? You're not then taking the communities as having the absolute truth, which you are then the mouthpiece of, but you're saying, oh, I have learned from this community. I have learned from a Christian community in a church that it is possible to enter a church and feel welcomed
Yeah.
and feel like everyone is welcome there. So it's a very diverse church. I was very surprised by the welcoming and warmth I felt by walking into that church. But you see, it's me doing that.
Yeah.
May not be you. Maybe you would have hated it. But I'm
Yeah,
sure there's a lot
absolutely.
of
Yeah,
people
yeah.
go to
But
churches that are,
this is
far
also
right, that would hate this church because, there's lesbians in the church, there's gay people in the church, there's people who are probably transgender. I think I've seen at least one
dreadful.
likely transgender person in the church. I mean, there's single women with kids. I haven't seen any single men with kids. There's normal male and female families. Some of them have kids, some of them don't have kids, some of them have 5 kids, some of them have 1 kid. Very diverse.
So since they are accustomed to this diversity, for them, then it's natural to be open. Yeah. Because I think in the moment where you exercise also this diversified approach, and not only to intellectual knowledge, but also in religion, in how we relate to others, you can also appreciate much better this diversity without necessarily agreeing or without necessarily becoming like them. In fact, I don't know how it's I think we have on the whole world now, but we can see, for example, in Germany, you can see that those places, those communities that have more diversity and even also more issues with this diversity, because when you have a very diverse society with community, with people with migrants, with people with very different social and economical status and so on, you would intellectually, you would tend to believe that there are more stronger forms of resistance and of xenophobia and racism. But you can clearly show that exactly the opposite happens. Those communities that are more diverse, the racism is less, much less. It still exists everywhere, like in every community, but it's much less. It's much weaker. Whereas those communities that are uniform, and even don't like diversity and resist against a change towards which is also a form of change of a state of consciousness, if you wish, in a sense. Change in multiperspectivalism also. In these communities that are much more uniform, and the same language, the same skin color, the same religion, the same everything, there the forms of xenophobia are much stronger, despite the fact that they have much less all the issues that come with multiculti. We call it multiculti in Germany, multiculturalism.
Now, so we were going to talk earlier about, you mentioned these 2 audio recordings that I sometimes play to illustrate states of consciousness. I'm not suggesting we do that. I'm making a segue from that to what you just said, which is that each of these communities we're talking about could be looked at as a state of consciousness.
Yeah.
So, and that's what I wanted people to experience with the example I was going to give of different types of music. I'll describe what that is. So when I try to have people understand what a state of consciousness is, I cannot define it. No one can define what a state of consciousness is. But we have these words, state of consciousness. So it must be something that people experience. So my idea was, let's give people an experience of a state of consciousness. So I play a very ethereal music that just, it's, we would say in a spiritual sense, it's disincarnating. It just lifts you out of your body and you're kind of floating in your consciousness and it feels really odd. And then immediately after that, I play some consciousness music with a very strong beat. And I ask people not to move when it changes. And so the beat then just draws them back into, it's almost painful. It's like, whoa, I am here. I have a body. I should be dancing. But I tell them, don't move. So they have to really feel that in strong incarnation. And I say, those are two states of consciousness. Now you know what they are. But then we can go on from there to talk about other aspects of states of consciousness. We've approached that in a different way. Now we can say, okay, think about those communities that are very strong, like you said, relatively homogeneous communities, which you belong to, speaking to the listeners now. And think about what it feels like to be in those communities and how your consciousness, what you're aware of, the kind of thoughts you have, all of that experience is different in those very strong communities. Those are states of consciousness.
Yeah, definitely.
And so those, now I start to get really weird. What happens then in the kind of training that Steiner and other spiritual paths do is they allow you to see behind those individual experiences to something else that exists in there, which is not cognitive, things that exist. There are words for this, but I don't like any of the words. So I'm just saying that experience of a state of consciousness can be deepened until it transforms into something else. And that something else then becomes aware, let me call it presence, become aware of a kind of presence. And that is most easy to see in the United States in the different political communities.
Yeah.
Becoming, just sitting with the people who have very strongly different political beliefs, it just feels completely different. And you can start to have that experience of different types of presence in those different communities.
But
I don't mean judgment here, I just mean experience.
Yeah, it's not, however, something mental. Yeah? It's not an intellectual understanding. It's this feeling, this inner feeling, this atmosphere, sort of atmosphere in the environment. Yeah, in fact, and that's why I have this obsession. People who know me know that I have this obsession of making this distinction between mind and consciousness. Mind is one thing, and consciousness is, I would say, even something even deeper. Huh? It's not just mind. This consciousness is sort of state of being, a state of feeling, a state of awareness, a state of getting into contact with something that goes beyond our body in a state of being. Whereas mind refers always to some intellectual knowledge. You are so and so and so. You of that religion? You have this political opinion? Or you, and is more something superficial, and is something that comes and goes, and very different. And unfortunately, nowadays we put this together, put it in one pot, shake it, and use the same words for very different things. By the way, also from a linguistic point of view, we have this issue that I use a word, let's say consciousness, for example. I had this experience that many years ago, and that left me deeply impressed that for I would say half an hour, I was going on to converse with someone, with a physician, and we were speaking about consciousness. Yeah, and we really could not understand, what are you talking about? Yeah, and she could not understand me, and I could not understand what she was talking about. At some point, I asked her, what do you mean by the word consciousness? And she says, well, it's when you look in a mirror and you recognize yourself, and you have this self-recognition in a mirror. You know, some animals are able to do that, and some others we are able, and some few animals are able to do that. Most animals are not. And that's what I mean by consciousness. Oh, okay. Is that no? Because I mean something completely different by the word consciousness. But we gave it for granted that we were using the same word, but we meant and feel, yeah, I think, something completely different that stands for that word and world also, because every word is the same word can be in very different worlds. Yeah, and I think I was just saying this is just to get again some short anecdote of my life that characterizes what you just said, I think, right? Yeah, great. I think there are a lot of other things to say about that. Yes. So your interest in, but let me perhaps just conclude this with the last question. Does this thing with consciousness has something, did you also relate it to biology, to plants, to botany, or would you say this is something, again, that is it's a different topic? Then I tell you why I asked this question, because it is also, I have something in the background.
Well, for me, everything in a way is a spiritual practice. And so how could we make botany a spiritual practice? And I mean, in a way, you don't have to make it. It already is. Just depends on how the person approaches it, what type of practice it is. You can approach it very intellectually. You can approach it in other kinds of ways. So it's a big topic. I'll try to give an example of one type of way to approach plants. A different kind of way that there's nothing written about this, and I don't think I can write anything about it, because it's about leading people to a different experience of plants. And what's important is the experience, not that you have a concept. So the concepts are, you could read in Rudolf Steiner, talking about what he calls the etheric, the astral, the spiritual. And I can say words around those. I'm not sure that it will mean anything, but the quick words around them. Etheric, it's the life processes in the human body, the life processes, what keeps the body alive instead of dead, even though the chemicals are all the same right there at the time of death. Everything is chemically the same, but there has been a change about what he calls the etheric. The astral, you could say it's in the human being about feelings, not just about staying alive, but about this other world we've been talking about, feels like something. And then the spiritual, it's reflected, the easiest place to see it reflected is in ideas. Ideas are spiritual aspects. They're not just feelings. They're not just things about keeping your body alive. There's something else. Yeah. Okay. That's all abstract, but necessary background. So now let's say we take two plants and we look at them in comparison. So we can sit down with a group and we can compare them with each other. And it's better if they're in flower, much better if they're in flower. And now to really do this, we would have to have two pictures of plants. But so let's say there's a plant here and it's got very simple leaves, no little squiggly things on the side of the leaves. The leaves are attached on the stem, so they're opposite each other like this. And it's got flowers that come out in clusters from the place where the leaf is attached. And the flowers they're not big and showy. They're kind of small and they have a lot of detail in them, a lot of structure in them, but they're not very big, and they have kind of a off-white or even a creamy yellow color down into this plant. And when you break the plant open, break a leaf off, it has a milky sap that comes out of the plant. And then the other plant has leaves that are very different. They're not attached next to each other. They're attached like this, and they spiral around the plant. So you could follow them up and they go in a spiral on the plant. And they have lots of little indentations on the leaves, and the depth of those indentations changes. It's not very strong at the top. It gets really strong in the middle where they have lots of indentations. And then at the top, the leaves are really almost like fingers again. They're almost like a finger attached to the stem of the plant. There are no indentations or anything else. So there's a big change in the leaves. And the flowers of the plant come at the top or very near the top, and they are much showier. They're like showing themselves off to the top at the top instead of being down here. So looking at these two plants, you can have very different experiences of them. And you can then point out to them, well, in this plant, what Steiner calls the etheric is expressed in this way. It's expressed in the form of the leaves, in the greenness of the leaves, in the fact that they have this differentiation on them. They go through a metamorphosis on the plant. Now we're starting to already reach into something that we would call not just etheric, but astral. And then that astral is experienced in the flowers. And look at where the flowers are. They're at the very top of the plant. It's like the flowers they've been kind of dropped here on the top of the plant from the sky. This is a one way in which we would call the astral comes into explaining in this plant. Now we look at the other plant. Well, we're talking about the flowers. Let's start with the flowers. Look at the flowers here. They're way down. They're not up at the top. They're down inside the plant. And when we break them off, the flowers and the leaves have a milky sap to them. So we'd say, look, the astral here is penetrating more deeply into the plant. And we see that also. Look at the leaves. The leaves don't have that metamorphosis. There's almost no metamorphosis. Every leaf is about the same. They're opposite from each other. And they're very simple outlines, no little crenulations on the side of the leaf. So that, again, the etheric is there in the greenness and the things of the leaves, but the astral has penetrated in a different way so that it's coming down and it's kind of preventing, you'd say the astral is penetrated so much that it's preventing the metamorphosis of the leaves. It keeps them all the same there. So this plant, of course, is more poisonous than this one. And that also is all those things I've said are illustrated in the milkiness of the sap that's here and is not here, clear sap over here. Okay, so that's one kind of as strong example as I could think of what I had to describe. But you can do that with many other plants. Yeah. And so you come to an experience of something in the plant realm that is etheric and astral. And I find it, you could do things like this with animals and with humans. But I find that working with plants in this way is completely safe. There's no, and it's because, from a Steiner perspective, you would say it's because of how the astral relates to the plant. It's still outside of, even in the plants like this, where it penetrates more, it is still mostly outside of the plant. Whereas when I said, well, the astral is an I, well, in humans, it's embedded in us. It's a feeling life in us. It gives it a very different kind of characteristic.
Yeah.
And so I love, so this, these are esoteric reasons why I became a botanist. Plants are, in a spiritual sense, very, very safe to work with. They're not going to push you in this direction or that direction. And you can look at them relatively, I don't like the word objectively, but you can have these experiences of the plants that don't cause you, that don't require that you make as much of a moral decision. So working with human beings, you see that very strongly. Anything that you do with human beings, you've got to make a moral decision about how you're going to respect the individuality of that person. And that's been instantiated in lots of rules about doing research with human beings. So every university in the States, and I'm sure in Europe, has very strong rules about the kinds of things you can do, the kinds of things that you can't do, and you have to justify all of your research procedures and get approval from them for them in advance, because there is this moral aspect that is there with human beings and with animals. And with plants, oh yeah, you can do whatever you want. There's no rules. They're easy to work with. This is the practical implications of what I'm saying about that it's kind of safe to work in plants with these spiritual things.
So it's a sort of more qualitative approach, a spiritual, experiential approach, like Goethe, because this was what I had in mind, this Goethean approach, which, he didn't talk about astral and the ethereal, but essentially he had a vision, he looked at the plant, and not only plants, but also nature, animals, and geology, by the way, also, from not a quantitative point of view, but a qualitative point of view. He, as far as I could see, he involved less the emotional aspect. He had more this intuitive aspect of the mind. I would call intuitive mind approach. But there's a whole there are many dimensions with which we can look at nature beyond the purely quantitative and mathematical approach of science. And yet for me, they are just two poles. There is no contradiction. I like to be still the objective mathematical guy, but also the first person approach guy. First person and third person approach are they complement to each other. What is your take about so-called vitalism? Because officially vitalism has been banned from biology, and it's anathema. It's something that it's considered completely wrong and a relic of history. But would this point of view, when you speak of the astral that comes down into the plant and is more contained or more expressed, and so can we define this as a vitalist approach or something like that?
Oh, vitalism seemed to be, I'm not an expert on the history of science, and this is really a question partly for somewhere in the history of science.
Right.
The little things that I've read about it seems like it's an intellectual idea, and it was rejected as an intellectual idea. And the people who put it forward as an intellectual idea might have had an experience, something like I've tried to describe with the experience of what Steiner called the etheric. And because they had that experience, or they noticed something, like there's a big difference between an alive human body and a dead human body, even though the difference between them in time, may be a minute or less, there's still a big difference there. They were trying to get at that in some way. And then, the idea didn't take off, either because other people didn't have the same experience, or because the communities were so strong about the way that they were pursuing the world that it seemed like a sideline. They wouldn't want to pursue that. I don't know. We'd have to look into the history about why. But I'm not suggesting we try to reintroduce vitalism as a intellectual study. I think that there's value to what I've said about experiencing plants in a different way. And I do, since these kinds of experiences of nature are very real, I think we can ask, well, if they're real, where do these experiences find themselves expressed in normal science? Because they do, but they're hidden. But so if you look at an ecologist, one thing I did, I studied scientific communication, wrote a book on scientific communication. And so I looked at a lot of posters. I also wrote a chapter on posters. So you look at a poster, and in some place in the poster, there is a picture of the scientists. And or sometimes you see this in their slot in their when they're giving a talk, they'll put a picture of them. And it will oftentimes, and with ecologists, be them out in nature something.
Mm-hmm.
And they're doing their research and they are alive. They are just excited. And and then of course all of that enthusiasm that they have, which drives everything they do in science, they then take it all out and they make their science objective. And this is one of the things
when you have to write a paper and
I keep try to tell scientists when I have a chance is, you want to have your work understood. You have to show your audience why it's important to you, especially an audience that is not scientific, but even an audience that you think is scientific. So I can give you a really crazy example of this that let me see. Well, I'll give two examples. Rolf Rudeshauser, when he first gave his first talk as a botanist. Rolf Rudeshauser is a friend, a botanist who's done some very interesting work, a Swiss person. He went to a European Botanical Congress. Everything okay?
No, I'm just looking up the page, the Wikipedia page of him, but I just lost it. I had it here, but okay, doesn't matter.
Oh, it doesn't matter what the experience. So he always had slightly different ideas than the mainstream. So he went to a conference, he gave his talk, and a very famous botanist, one of the most famous ones in the country, stood up with the question period and said, "Well, this is really schoolboy science." And Rolf says, it was completely amazing. Every person in that audience was then on my side. So that's kind of a backward example, right? But it shows, right? So Rolf was up there. Rolf is a very expressive person. He's always joking and even in his talks and really connecting with the audience. The other kind of example is from me. I gave a talk and had 15 minutes to give the talk, and I was running a little bit of late on the talk. So, and the person who was hosting the session stood up. It was a young woman, a graduate student, very brave of her to host a scientific session. And she stood up to indicate that I had 1 minute left. And I looked over at her and I said, 1 minute. Oh, wow. I guess I should have practiced this. And the whole audience erupted in laughter. And I got more than a minute left. I think I had 2 minutes left to finish what I was saying. I was almost done anyway. But those kinds of connections with the audience make a really big difference if you're going to be understood. And even better, those are things that both happened at the ends of talks. Even better, if at the beginning of the talk, you don't have your hands in your pockets, you have your hands out, you're gesturing to the audience, you're making them know that you're welcome, that you're acting like you actually are interested in talking to them, that they should care about what you're saying. It makes a huge difference.
Here we have again the psychological dimension. When I write something, and I read it, whatever I write and how I write it, it doesn't matter. It doesn't come through. When it comes from the heart, and it's spontaneous, then it goes through better. But it's not always something that you can have. It's difficult to have it. At least for me, that's part of my character, to be this perfectly spontaneous guy that is able to convey an idea, which is not really an idea, but it's an intuition. It's something that has its qualitative dimension that you must feel and perceive. But yet you have to communicate through words, which are very often not enough. And you have to use this psychological extra. Well, that's also something vital, some vitalistic force. and it gets into the audience much better.
Yes.
But I have to make still some exercise to be able to do that, but because I'm
So
not just
two things. One, we're still talking about what we were before. I just want to close the loop for people who are listening.
Yeah.
We're still talking about finding yourself and
Yeah.
expressing yourself in the correct ways, in the ways that really show something of yourself to an audience.
Exactly.
We detoured there a little bit through other areas, but we're still really talking about the same thing. The alternative is when you just give a dry presentation, you're sitting in one of your communities, right?
Mhm.
You're doing only what that community is. You haven't found yourself. You're just repeating a kind of community norms. And you see a lot of students doing this, and even a lot of senior scientists doing this. They stay within those norms. But to even just come up there and let yourself be seen as a person, even if you don't talk anything about yourself, just in the way that you express yourself, you let yourself be seen. That's this other thing. That's that finding yourself and finding yourself in the communities.
Absolutely.
And I think I've lost what I wanted to say in the second thing. That was really the most important one. Oh, no, I know the second one. So what helped me do exactly what I've just said, to express yourself and to do things improvisationally, is to study improv. And so if you have time, I recommend, most scientists will not do this because they don't have time, but find an improv group in your area and go to it. And learn to turn off your mind and just be present with what's happening next, and your communication skills will improve.
Turn off the mind. Yeah, that's also a very important aspect. Yeah. Good advice. Good advice. For me, actually, it's a bit difficult because I'm living in a little town of 6,000 souls in the middle of nowhere. But I will keep this in mind when eventually we'll have an occasion to do that. Yeah, it can be very useful. Yeah, great. So, Bruce, thank you very much for your interesting talk, because I think a lot of things went through here, which are not just intellectual. A lot of inputs that can be useful also as a practice, in our environment where we work, not necessarily academic, but every kind of environment. I think it can be useful. And great. So thank you very much. And I would say we can wrap it up here.
Yes, thank you very much. Really a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you.